Great, thank you, Jay, and welcome everybody. So today we'll be covering incremental load and scheduled executions. Now, if you're just getting started with us or you're not sure what the prerequisites are for this particular episode, feel free to check out that YouTube playlist. We'll be posting some links through this chat as we go, as well as in the video description once this is done. All right, so just kind of jumping in here. Let's first define really what is an incremental load. So this is kind of the opposite of what a full load would be, basically grabbing all of the data and then bringing it forward through these different layers, the ODX, the MDW, semantic layer. That's really a full load. For performance reasons, though, we also have incremental load. This is basically looking at the delta, the change between two data sets. So let's say I have a sales transaction set, maybe it's billions of rows, something truly large, and then we're just looking to, pull every 15 minutes, what are the latest transactions? Incremental load would be a great way to do that because it will be much, much more performant. Now, I do want to make one first point here, which is these things are not in opposition. You could easily set up both incremental load and say like a weekly full load, just to make sure you are capturing all of those records. And as we go through, if you have any questions, please do pop those in the chat. We'll be getting to them as we can go. So in today's example, I'll be working with a REST API, pulling it through the, sorry, I was trying to multitask. I saw this question. Rob, you asked about us doing configure multiple environments. We actually changed the schedule. So it is kind of a dynamic scheduling, but we'll be getting to that one, I think, next week or next session. All right, so in today's example, I'll be looking at a weather API, pulling that in through the data lake and then through the rest of the project, really. Now, in TimeXtender, this works in two functionalities. First, we're going to schedule the task in the ODX, and then we're going to schedule the execution package for the rest of the project, the MDW and the semantic layer. And the reason why becomes clear when we think about an example. So let's say we have 3 different data sources flowing to a dashboard. Each of these different data sources can easily have a different refresh schedule depending on the availability of the data. Okay, so let's say we look at weather every 5 minutes. Maybe that's the level of granularity or the latest data that's available through the API. Sales transactions maybe is only updated every 15 minutes at the source, so let's just set it at that. And then foot traffic, how many people are coming through the store. Now, when we think about our end users in this dashboard, maybe we want to just grab the latest changes. So we'll do 3 cycles of API and 1 cycle of sales transactions every 15 minutes, disregarding this foot traffic. Now, in the older versions of TimeXtender, it was a bit more work to get this kind of setup. With the latest versions of ODX, it's very, very fast. And we'll walk through that today. All right. Without further ado, let's go ahead and look at how this is done. So I've already got a REST API configured in the ODX. So we'll set up some primary key and incremental load rules. We'll schedule that data refresh, integrate the data into a fresh MDW, check the primary key just to make sure it's what we would expect, and then we'll create and schedule a new execution package. All right. So here is kind of the basic project. I don't have anything in the MDW yet. You can see no tables. Let's just talk about the data source for a moment. I'm using tomorrow.io. I had used different weather APIs in the past. This one seemed to be pretty performant. What I liked about it was there was a limit of 25 calls at the free tier, which I thought would be great for this demo. Now, since I've been prototyping, I decided to go with the paid tier. But again, this goes to that scheduling aspect of when I want to think about how often I'll pull that data in. This could be one of those factors, right? If I'm hitting an API that I'm not paying for, maybe I want to set it well within that threshold so that I'm getting a more periodic result, not exhausting it, say, in the first 40 minutes and then having a gap in data for 20 or so. All right. So when we go to set this up, I've already got Seattle weather. It's already set with a sync and transfer task. The first thing that we'll do is go ahead and just execute this transfer task the first time to initiate the manual pull. We'll take a look at that in SSMS just to make sure that everything is flowing correctly. It should only take a few seconds. And then we'll go through and set up that incremental load rule. All right. So it looks like it was successful. Great. When I go over into SSMS, I'm just going to refresh this. Yeah. And we'll be able to see that table. Now, incremental load is going to handle several different pieces. If there's schema drift, it will basically cause a new full load for this table. So in the ODX, it will look really clean. If you look in the actual database itself, you'll see numerous copies. At that point, you're just going to want to look for the latest timestamp. You'll see it here at the end. But if we open this up, we'll see. Okay. The beauty of live demos, right? You can tell that I'm really doing it. All right. So I did mess with the changing around some of these databases. So I'm just going to try and synchronize and execute and see if that works. It's funny though, because you did see that the data table was there. So I'm curious what the issue is. Just refresh the entire thing. Yeah, it thinks it's still connected to the old one. So great. That's fun. Easiest thing to do here is just to troubleshoot. I'm just going to recreate that database, I guess, that I was using before, and we'll push that forward. So one of the things, this is not intended, I didn't plan this, but as you can see, when you make a mistake or you need to change something, it's really fast to do. So we'll go ahead and recreate that. The problem was that I've been going through this demo through the morning and yesterday a bit. And when I delete those databases, it's having trouble keeping up. I probably could restart the server, but I'm going to try and see if I can just hack this real quick. All right. Well, I won't say it was embarrassing, but definitely a good test. So let's see if I can look at this one. All right. No harm, no foul. We got this data in here, and now let's actually take a look at the data as it is in TimeXtender. And the reason is the following. It's actually going to tell me what are the primary keys and any incremental load rules. I can look at the data as well here. It'll probably take like 5 seconds to load. But the beauty is when I'm getting in here and I need to set up these two things, the primary key and the incremental load, I have two pieces I need to do. One, consider what is a unique key. Now, I've been working with this data for a while, a week or so, and I'll tell you those IDs, interval ID, timeline ID, values ID, are not unique. When they come in, the value is always 1. So in this particular case, I'm going to do something that's unusual. I'm going to use a timestamp for my primary key. Now, of course, it will be unique. Time marches on. But for the incremental load rule, that's almost always a timestamp as well. So what's funny about this weather data source is that my primary key and my load rule are both timestamps. It will actually work just fine, but usually if it were sales data or something like that, we would use, more traditional primary key. All right, so with that, let's set that primary key. You can just do this manually by adding the rules. What I like to do is kind of one fell swoop and just do the override function, which overrides and creates those rules simultaneously. Right. Next, we will set up the incremental load rule. Here, I will do it manually. I'm just going to say the start time is the column that I want to use for latest value. Now, please take a mental picture of this screen. We're going to come back to this. I want to talk to you about handle primary key updates and handle primary key deletes. It's important to understand when we think about the architecture, if I'm going to use either of these functions in the MDW or the execution packages, I have to set them up in the ODX. Kind of makes sense at a high level because how would the MDW know to monitor these things if the information wasn't passed along from the source at the beginning? But we'll talk about that more here in a moment. Okay. So we've got that rule. Start time is greater than last max value. Cool. We're all good to go there. Last thing we need to do is just set a schedule. So I'm going to set this to be very frequently updating now that I'm at that paid tier. I'm going to have it run every 2 minutes up until 11. All right. So let's take one more look here. We're just going to execute this view. We do only have one record. So by seeing more than one record here in the ODX, we'll know that that schedule is working. While that is in the background, let's go ahead and integrate some of this data. So we'll pull in this table into the MDW. Easy enough. Now, as of a few versions back, we have instituted automatic incremental load. Now, what that does is a few interesting things. One, it recognizes this is an incremental load table. What that really does is saves you work, right? I will deploy and execute this here in a moment, but you can see this little I. I could go through and set this up as an incremental load table, but it's kind of unnecessary because of the nature of how incremental loading works in this new automatic functionality. All right. So the next step that we had was to check the primary key. It was end time. That's the desired result. And now I'm going to add a new execution package. This is where I'm going to add the schedule. It's always a best practice to not to touch the default package, like adding a schedule or anything. I just include steps and I need to give it something very creative. Let's just say refresh. I'll need to deploy for this to work. Okay, so let's add a schedule here to this new refresh package. It's going to be very prescriptive starting right now. Let's do kind of the same as we did before. And do it every 2 minutes as well. Now, it's important to note also on your refresh schedules to not have ODX or MDW generally scheduling less than a 2-minute cycle. It's possible for it to work, but you may experience some sort of transient errors. The bigger deal is that the system is only scanning for updates about every 1 to 2 minutes. So that's why you may see some fault. Okay, next I'm going to deploy and execute everything because we have basically completed these tasks. We just need to see this work. All right. And of course, upon deployment, we can say incremental load is a part of those. It's creating those T-SQL scripts and writing those scripts, and then execution. It's just a single thread here because there was only one thing to do. We have filled those tables with data. So let's take a look at that here. All right. So I'll look at this valid table. You can see this underscore I as the incremental load table. Great. So we have 2 records. So we're up to date. There are 2 records here in the ODX as well, right? That's where the data is coming from. So now we'll look for 3 records in both. While we do that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about what's going on in the background. So again, incremental load is a process that's very easy to set up. We just went through the steps. We set up the schedule, the tasks, the primary keys, the incremental load rule for the ODX. Then all we had to do for the MDW was basically say, yep, we're good to go. Now, if I look at the table settings, we may notice that there are some pieces here that we could change. If I go to data extraction, this is set to automatic. So it's going to pick up whether it's a full load or incremental load rule. I could override it by selecting one of these 2. If I were to do that, I would deselect truncate valid table. It's also going to tell me to deselect that, so I don't have to remember that. But this is where you're going to see soft and hard deletes. So remember, TimeXtender is not going to delete any records in your database unless you use the SQL cleanup tool, but they will disappear for the TimeXtender user looking through the GUI. All right, keep values up to date. This would be not really a use case for weather data, but again, if I were looking at some other kind of data, maybe sales data, then I would want to do that. We can talk kind of about what that is. Basically, if there are lookups in that table, this is going to be an important piece because I may get those lookups out of sync, right? That's not part of the incremental load process, is to update that lookup table. But if you have this selected, then those lookups would be updated too. All right. So let's close this. We'll be able to see this running perhaps, but before we do that, let's take a look. So I told you to take this mental picture. The idea here is, again, when I'm setting up incremental load on the ODX, I need to choose whether either of these 2 properties will be selected. So handle primary key updates is basically checking all of the primary keys to see if there are any changes to those records, right? Does this does this record exist, is part of the fundamental piece of this where clause statement that we're doing to do incremental load. Is this primary key already in the records? If not, use it for the incremental load. That's how that works. When you do handle primary key updates, then what we're doing is seeing if there are any changes to those records, not just if that ID exists, okay? The reverse would be true for deletes. If the record is now missing but was there, then we need to keep basically a list of what all the historical primary keys were and check both of those. So let's see an example here. If I think I have an incremental load running around 130, we can see, maybe this is our first full load. It's only one sales order, something that came in just 15 minutes prior, 5 line items. Okay, fair enough. 15 minutes later, we have another sales order. Looks like this is our first incremental load. It's just pulling that delta. There's 2 more line items, and we'll see that process basically repeated one more time. Okay, so that's basically incremental load. We're just looking at those deltas, pulling in those records through the different layers like we just set up. When we go to handle primary key updates, it's like saying, okay, so now I've changed the quantity here and I added a discount. Check all of these for if there's anything having to do with the primary keys that are updated. And here's our incremental load rule. It's set on that timestamp, which is generally what you would do. Deletes would be the opposite, right? Now we have 2 line items that are gone. And again, if this is not set up in the ODX, I can't tell the MDW to set that rule because it's not going to have that data. It's not going to know in the back end how this works. All right. So just to kind of review, if your final data kind of looked like this, maybe you're doing a weekly full load, which could be a great idea, capturing all of these changes. If there was some error that passed silently or one of the executions that didn't run, you want to think about how you're incorporating that. The important thing to know is it's not just a no-brainer that you would turn this on. Handling primary key updates will not cause any significant impact performance. However, handling deletes will, right? The way that this would work is because primary key updates is already basically a part of that system. If I have that selected in the ODX, the MDW will be a very low overhead. But if I handle deletes, that could significantly impact performance. So I wouldn't want to do that unless that really made sense for my use case. All right, so I would love to invite anybody who has questions to feel free and put those in the chat now. Otherwise, if you do have any ideas for future episodes, we'll get to those in the community. Before I do that, though, let's check and see if this process worked. All right, so we can see that the transfer, I just saw that kick off. Let's take a look one more time here. We are in the ODX, I'm gonna execute. Great, we have 5. All right, moment of truth, let's see. All right, beautiful. We could also see that here in the MDW. We can see those 5 records. Great, so we're running every 2 minutes. We can see these timestamps. I think these are out of order. Nope, they're in order. Great. Cool. We met our task.
Nice work, Taylor. Hey, I think we might have set a little bit of a record. Oh, wait, we have a question from Rory. Okay. Will this kind of tight scheduling result in locking issues?
I don't know. I don't think so. But let me get back to you on that. Let me take that as a note. What do you mean by that, Rory? Can you add any more?
He says dirty reads are still in the future.
So I think I'll take this offline and follow up with you. But I think that we're going to be able to handle those in a few different ways. Let me get back to you with a more robust answer, but we can handle dirty reads a number of different ways through the table settings. So we can look at that, kind of how the primary keys are being updated and all that, but let me follow up with you about that. That's a great question.
All right. Thank you, Rory. This is almost the first time we've stumped the chumps. You almost had a self stump the chumps there, Taylor. And It's not the way we envisioned it when we thought of Stump the Chumps, and you sorted it out. So there was no stumping involved. So nice work. Nice work on that.
Thank you.
We do have a Stump the Chumps question, though, from Rebecca Moser. Do you want to launch into that, Becky?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jay. And great presentation, Taylor. That was really awesome. For those of you that don't know me, I am TimeXtender's social media and content marketing person. They call me an expert, but that's too kind. So I have been trying to up my technical knowledge lately with Taylor. We've been working on this for a few months now. So I actually kind of feel qualified to ask this question. Taylor, what is the difference between incremental load and history in TimeXtender?
Great question. Yeah, at first glance, they would look very similar. And I know that as you and I've been talking about how TimeXtender is going to do these two different pieces, both would have kind of pieces to the data that we're looking to update. But at their core, they serve totally different functions. So incremental load, we're basically trying to use a performance gain, right? At the beginning of the presentation, we talked about incremental load being really more of a performance gain, only loading the delta in, and to Rory's point, he's thinking about how do these pieces come together? How do we think about, dirty reads or anything moving from one system to the next? The idea with incremental load is just loading the data deltas. Now with history, if I were to turn this on, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to pick more specifically what and when I want this to update. So that gets more into like slowly changing dimensions. For weather, it doesn't really make sense, right? And weather may have not been the best example. We can see that it loads very quickly, right? The weather's always changing. But with history, say we have sales performance. So you and some of your other colleagues are selling, you're updating your numbers. We want to look at these different types of fields. So we'll set our natural key. We have type 0, type 1, and type 2. Of course, type 0 is more or less ignored. Type 1 is updated, but it won't create a new record. With type 2, it will actually initiate a new type of record. And we should probably do an actual TimeXtender Tuesdays episode about history and slowly changing dimensions. I don't know that I'm throwing enough at you right now, but the way that this would work is incremental load is only pulling in what that current record is. History would actually create new records depending on how I'm tracking that. Okay.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm looking at these fields. I'm trying to think what would make the most sense for whether since we've already used our timestamps, I think it probably wouldn't make any sense. We'd need to think probably more about a full-scale demo to show you something that would be changing. I have some ideas, but great question. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Well, that was a 2-for-1 in that we got a great question and a possible topic for a future episode. We put in a link in the chat for our survey. If you would be so kind as to go in and suggest any other topics you'd like us to do in the future, we'd be eager to update our future schedule. We also have some terrific online classes for TimeXtender, so we will post up a link for that as well. So you can pursue your TimeXtender certification. All right, do we have any other questions? I don't think I see any others here. Any other questions for the good of the order? If not, we'll wrap up just a couple minutes early this time. Oh, all right, all good. Well, like I said, we'll be posting this video up later today and sending out the link to the playlist. You can see all of our other 8 episodes there, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks for the next episode of TimeXtender Tuesdays.